Hey, everybody. It is Tuesday, February 25th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Nunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. And I understand, Jill, we have a special birthday today.
We do, and it is not mine. It is my mom. Happy birthday. Happy 75th birthday to Carol Wagner.
But you don't call her Carol. You still call her Mom, right?
Yeah, I don't know why I said that. It was weird. Hi, happy birthday, Mom.
Formalities. Yes, happy birthday, Carol. We did a Mother's Day podcast a couple years ago, starring our moms, Debbie and Carol, respectively. So if you want to go in the Wayback Machine on the podcast and you want to get to know Carol and Debbie, for that matter, definitely check out that episode.
Yes, but this is a big birthday, the big 7-5. Definitely a milestone.
Big party tonight? This weekend?
This weekend, yes. We're going to do a big dinner to celebrate.
Oh, my father's turning 75 this year, too. In just a few weeks, in April.
We'll get on it.
No, that was a good reminder. He doesn't like parties and that jazz, but rest assured we will do something against his will.
All right, let's get to some headlines here. 3 years after Russia invaded Ukraine, President Trump claims this war could be over in a matter of weeks. What exactly he means by that?
Yeah, we'll take you inside his meeting with the French president yesterday inside the Oval Office.
Plus, remember that email Elon Musk sent to government workers this weekend? Turns out replying is voluntary unless you ask President Trump. Confused? Well, imagine being a government worker.
Jill, 24 hours later, still not much clarity.
Podcaster and ex-Secret Service agent Dan Bongino will be the number 2 at the FBI.
We'll tell you why this was a controversial choice.
The mayor of Los Angeles has fired the fire chief who criticized her budget cuts. Now there's a big movement to get her job back. An update on the health of Pope Francis. A lot of noise on social media yesterday about whether the Super Bowl winning Philadelphia Eagles are rejecting a White House invite. We're going to clear up the confusion.
Yes, it came from a news source that we here at Mo News don't use, and we want to make sure you're not using it either.
In the market for a new home? Well, finally, it appears that home buyers are getting the upper hand again.
This is personal news for Jill Wagner.
And we remember Roberta Flack, singer of Killing Me Softly.
We'll tell you about the origins of that song and the various remakes.
And Moshe has on this day in history.
We got some new ones for you today. I've been doing some digging because we've actually never done a February 25th on this day in history. So a little bit of presidential intermarriage history. Yes. And we take you inside the fight that made Muhammad Ali.
Okay, our big story today. Monday marked 3 years of war between Russia and Ukraine following Russia's full-scale invasion of its neighbor. President Trump, meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron at the White House on Monday, said that he believes that this war could end within weeks. He's trying to push for talks to wind down the conflict. It's led to more than 1 million deaths, more than 10 million Ukrainians displaced, and the widespread destruction of Ukraine. Russia currently occupies about 20% of the country and has been charged with war crimes. President Trump's taken a new tack regarding the conflict, pushing the U.S. to take a more neutral position and engaging Russia and Vladimir Putin in talks. He said Monday he's had productive talks with the Russians and that Putin has accepted the idea of European peacekeepers in Ukraine. However, he added that Russia maintains that it will likely not cede much of the Ukrainian territory that they currently occupy. That is something that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has wholly rejected. The meeting between Macron and Trump came after a week of escalating uncertainty among Europeans about the U.S. commitment to its longtime allies. And that was evident on Monday. The U.S. joined Russia, Belarus, North Korea, and a dozen other countries in voting against a UN resolution condemning Russia as the aggressor in Ukraine's war. The resolution called for de-escalation in Ukraine, an early end to hostilities, and a peaceful resolution. The resolution called for de-escalation in Ukraine, an end to the hostilities, and a peaceful resolution. It's non-binding, but the U.S. vote against it signals the country's weakening support for Ukraine under the Trump administration in favor of closer ties to Russia. Just a week ago, U.S. officials met with Russian leaders to talk about a peace deal, notably not inviting leaders from Ukraine. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth also made it clear that the U.S. will not be sending troops to Ukraine to maintain security if a ceasefire is negotiated, and that Ukraine will not be welcomed into NATO.
Yeah, so this new position, while not altogether surprising given Trump's rhetoric during the campaign, has still been a shock to the system, especially in Europe. So this was a big deal that Macron, effectively now the leader of the coalition to back up and save Ukraine, visited the White House, and he feels he has a grasp for how to manage Trump, how to negotiate with Trump. Because remember, he was president back during Trump's first term, so has some of the lengthiest experience with the U.S. president. So Trump spoke yesterday about European peacekeepers going into Ukraine after the war to keep the peace. He says that he mentioned it directly in his call to Vladimir Putin, and Putin was okay with it. That's what Trump told the media yesterday. Though Putin, when he was asked by the media about the state of talks, was very, very vague, saying, "I have not agreed to anything." All of this, though, comes at the expense of Ukraine's dream, which is to regain all of its territory and also get membership inside NATO. Most of Europe agrees with it as well. The Biden administration agreed with it as well. They just wanted to wait until after the war as to not immediately get NATO involved in an active conflict. Nonetheless, with Trump's opposition here, with Trump trying to do things that are amenable to Putin to bring an end to this conflict, are very unlikely to see Ukraine enter NATO. Even on Sunday, Zelensky said, "I'll step down if that helps the negotiations here," given Trump's feelings about him. Even on Sunday, you saw Zelensky make headlines by saying he's ready to give up power if that would mean that Ukraine could enter NATO, given Trump's feelings about him. It doesn't look like that's going to help the cause, even if he does step down, having this resignation in exchange for NATO membership. So they're trying to find a backup plan here. The big concern in Europe is Putin has already shown in the past decade that he was willing to invade Ukraine twice. And so what's to prevent him from doing it another time, to take even more territory after he's able to, bolster his military forces, get weapons again. And that's Ukraine's big concern here. And that's Europe's big concern, because they know that based on Putin's rhetoric, he's not going to stop at Ukraine. The Trump administration has said, listen, this is your job. You guys figure it out. We're going to end this conflict, and we're not getting involved. And you guys are going to take care of your own security. And that's a bit of what you heard Macron say yesterday. He's like, we understand our responsibility in Europe. Europe has come to rely on the U.S. for the past 8 decades or so as a security backup against the then Soviet Union and now Vladimir Putin. Macron, as part of this visit, was trying to bring the U.S. closer back to Europe, help Trump see their side of things. He sees himself as a leader here, as I mentioned. Now that the U.S. has effectively abandoned the alliance, so to speak, Europe's in the backyard of Russia. So they want to get as much help as they can from Donald Trump here. Now, Trump doesn't see a point in keeping this war going at the expense of more Ukrainian territory, more lives, Europe much more cautious about Putin. And there was an interesting exchange yesterday during the press conference where Macron was asked by a reporter, hey, you spoke at length with Vladimir Putin ahead of the war. Did you share any of those lessons with Donald Trump as he negotiates with Vladimir Putin? And Macron is very diplomatic. It's a reason why he's had power for so long. And he said, listen, I'm not going to tell Trump what to do, but effectively then went on to say, Putin's a big liar, and any promises he makes, you can't trust. And so effectively, that was the lesson Macron was trying to pass along there to Trump, who considers himself a great negotiator, says, I can take care of this. Macron effectively saying, watch out with this guy, Vladimir Putin. And that's something former presidents will tell you, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, a number of presidents who've had to deal with Putin over the last 2 decades are like, yeah, he's a big liar and you can't trust him. You can't trust any promises that he makes. One other note I'll make here. We've been telling you about this negotiation happening between Trump and Zelensky, the war of words they had last week. Right now, Trump is pushing Ukraine to give the U.S. mineral rights. He says, we've given you $180 billion in aid the past few years. What are you giving us? So there are a lot of rare earth metals in Ukraine. Last week, the number was thrown about that he wants access to 500 billion with a B dollars worth of minerals inside Ukraine. Zelensky pushed back on that. That upset Trump. That led to this war of words. It appears there are the outlines of a plan here. The $500 billion is gone because even Zelensky was like, you haven't even given me 500 billion. That's like triple what you gave me. I'm not giving you that. But ultimately, Ukraine knows they got to make a deal here because they want U.S. military support after the war. They want the U.S. to back them up, given the U.S. role in the world. And so that's something we likely will see here in the coming days. The Treasury Secretary was sent to Kyiv in recent days to try to strike a deal here. It potentially includes part of Ukraine's revenues on minerals going to the U.S. Again, Trump saying, we gave you a bunch of stuff. We want something back.
So, Moshe, what exactly are you watching? Because we know, of course, U.S. officials have now met with Putin. Is there anything set up for Zelensky to be involved in any way in terms of talks about his country? What is next?
So Zelensky is sort of, I won't use the word begging, but very much interested in a direct meeting here with Donald Trump. He believes he can make his case in person. Trump says he's open to that. What you see here is the U.S. is taking the lead here. Until now, they're not involving Europe, and they haven't involved the Ukrainians. They've been trying to begin the conversation here with Russia. And typically what you see in these sorts of peace talks is you need an intermediary or intermediaries to talk to both sides, right? We've been watching it unfold in the Middle East between the Israelis and Hamas. You got the Qataris, you got the Egyptians, you got the Jordanians, you got the Americans. Well, in a similar vein here between Russia and Ukraine, the U.S. looks like it's going to take lead here with Russia. Then you have Macron and a bunch of the Europeans talking to Zelensky. The U.S. sort of wants to do its own thing here, and Trump wants to be the peacemaker. And so I think there's an understanding from the U.S., and they have had meetings, right, at a lower level, at the cabinet level, with Zelensky. I don't know what the time frame is like. I mean, Trump again threw out that time frame of it's in a matter of weeks. I think that's slightly optimistic. He was asked about traveling to Russia after the war is over. He said he's totally open to that. And then people threw out the date. There's a big annual holiday in Russia, the first week of May. He's like, oh, that's going to be too soon. So I think, we're likely looking at something this summer, but the two sides still very far apart, right? Ukraine's going to have to make an incredible concession to Russia, losing a significant part of its territory. Right now, 3.5 million Ukrainians are living under Russian occupation. And it doesn't look like many of them will get to be Ukrainians again. It looks like Russia is going to, keep hold of most of that territory. So that's something that Zelensky will have to figure out how to sell to the people there who have suffered immensely over these last 3 years. And so, we talk in broad strokes. It's going to be over soon. But what's it going to look like? And the big thing for Ukraine is, A, what they're giving up, but B, how do they ensure that if they give up what they give up, that they will never have to worry about another invasion by Vladimir Putin? Especially
if they're not going to be allowed into NATO.
Correct. Do you trust this European security force or whatever they're coming up with, which the Europeans have never had to put anything like that together before? NATO has done it. But of course, this is not a NATO country. So this presents a unique challenge. And does Putin even care? Will Putin say, one day in a couple of years, he wants to invade Ukraine again, and he'll be like, hey, European security force, you have 24 hours to get out because I'm invading tomorrow. Are they going to fight him? Or are they going to get out? And that's, the concern Zelensky has.
Okay, now to an update from the story that we brought you yesterday about the confusion across the U.S. government about that email from Elon Musk. So that email arrived over the weekend on Saturday. It came from the U.S. Government Office of Personnel Management. It's known as OPM, asking about 2 million federal employees to bullet point 5 things that they accomplished last week and send it in by last night. OPM is effectively the HR arm of the government, but it doesn't have direct power over most government employees who work across dozens of agencies. So there's the email. But then Elon Musk ratcheted things up in a post on X saying that if people didn't respond, that it would be viewed as a resignation. So that led to a ton of confusion about whether to believe the email or believe the Twitter post. On Monday, OPM clarified that the email was voluntary. But then to confuse things even more, President Trump on Monday echoed what Musk had originally said, that anyone who didn't answer the email would be fired or semi-fired.
Right. Hold on. I haven't heard that term before.
You're half fired.
You're half fired.
Figure it out.
It's like being half pregnant.
Here is President Trump defending the move.
I thought it was great because we have people that don't show up to work and nobody even knows if they work for the government. So by asking the question, tell us what you did this week, what he's doing is saying, are you actually working? And then if you don't answer, like you're sort of semi-fired or you're fired, because a lot of people are not answering because they don't even exist.
Musk also doubled down on his original message Monday, posting on X that anyone who didn't answer the email would, quote, soon be furthering their career elsewhere. Again, the original email sent from OPM did not include any threat for not answering.
Yeah, to email or not to email. Well, the deadline was last night. Federal workers had to make their own decisions. In some cases, they were waiting on their bosses. Some of them got official orders from various agencies like Defense, FBI, State, Energy, to not answer the email. Others said it's up to you. Others said you should. Basically, a whole variety of opinions across the government. Not surprisingly, federal workers, a group of them, filed a lawsuit yesterday against Elon Musk in federal court in California. The suit asked judges to block proposed mass layoffs across the government, including any connected to that email over the weekend. What's interesting, and we were telling you about this development yesterday, is that a number of the agency heads, like Kash Patel at FBI, Tulsi Gabbard at DNI, close to Elon Musk, close to the president, ultimate loyalists, told their people not to respond. Now, in many cases, that's because, well, if you're working for the Director of National Intelligence or the FBI, sending an unclassified email with 5 things you did last week might present a lot of issues and could, mean that your email could get into enemy hands, especially if you did something last week that is relevant to a country like that. Imagine you work at the FBI. What did you do last week? Name 5 things. That's not something they wanted out there. The whole situation remains messy, Jill. We're continuing to cover it and hear from a number of members of the Mo News community who work in the federal government. Workers are increasingly anxious about these things. Some of them have written us saying they love their jobs. They've worked in their jobs for a long time, but they're now actively looking to leave. They cannot take the stress, the chaos, the distraction from their work. Jill, one person wrote me that adults were in tears at work from the stress of all of this, given everything that's unfolded here in the past few weeks and the fact that their bosses don't even know what's going on. They haven't been told what's going on. And we told you part of this is intentional. Part of this is intentional by Musk. This is a bit of what he did at his previous companies, creating chaos, forcing people out. It's all about downsizing, even at the expense of losing institutional knowledge and good workers, with the idea that you've now gotten smaller. And if you have to rebuild, you'll rebuild. It's a very, kind of Machiavellian approach to cutting an organization.
Time for the speed read from CNN. A Secret Service agent turned right-wing podcaster turned deputy director of the FBI. President Trump announced Sunday that he has picked Dan Bongino to help oversee the Federal Bureau of Investigations. It is a job that typically goes to a career FBI agent. Bongino, meanwhile, is best known as a controversial podcaster. He was once banned from YouTube for violating the platform's COVID-19 policies, which preventing misinformation. He has been highly critical of the FBI. He's spread theories about the agency's role in 2016 and 2020 presidential elections and other matters. He also recently said on his podcast that Trump should be ignoring court orders in response to some of his controversial executive orders, and says that Trump actually won the 2020 election. When making the announcement, Trump praised Bongino as a patriot and highlighted his background in law enforcement. He also commended him for being willing to give up his hugely successful show, which is regularly in the top 10 podcasts, to serve the public. The deputy FBI director oversees all FBI operations on a day-to-day basis at the Bureau's 55 field offices.
So this is a key role, number 2, at the FBI. Bongino will be responsible for coordinating investigations, intelligence matters. It's a very serious, very important position. And it's notable because Bongino spends a lot of time on his podcast talking about how corrupt and unfixable the FBI is. Well, now he's been given a key role in fixing it. But the key thing about this number 2 role is especially when the FBI director, Inkesh Patel, has no experience at the FBI. For more than 100 years now, they have ensured that the deputy director always has gone to a career FBI agent. So now you have the number one and the number two at FBI with no experience ever at the FBI. And it's notable because the FBI Agents Association, that's the group that represents the agents, said that Patel in January assured the group's leaders, knowing that he doesn't have any experience there, that he would choose a number two that had experience in the organization. It appears he's gone back on that. Now, some of the criticism is obvious, right? His lack of experience, his partisanship. Patel noted in his confirmation hearing that despite his own partisanship and being very, political and very pro-Trump and, a huge critic of the organization, calling for a gutting of the FBI, that he wouldn't be very political. Well, now he's chosen a very political guy in Bongino. If you've ever listened to his podcast, by the way, it typically ranks as a top 10 podcast where he raves about the deep state. He's pushed various January 6th conspiracy theories. He's talked about how the FBI lies left and right. And so there's a lot of concern inside the FBI about this new leadership there and what it's going to mean to the organization, its priorities. Notably, this deputy director position, no Senate confirmation needed. It's not a Senate conferable position. So this nomination basically means he has the job. At the same time, the Trump people will tell you the FBI for them is broken. It's partisan. It's targeted conservatives. And that's why they've put in two outsiders to overhaul the Bureau.
All right, from the LA Times, in the aftermath of the devastating wildfires in LA last month that killed 26 people and destroyed thousands of homes, the Los Angeles fire chief was fired by the mayor late last week. LA Mayor Karen Bass blamed former Chief Kristen Crowley for mishandling the department's response and failing to warn her about an imminent fire risk in the city. On Saturday, Crowley responded by defending her choices and saying that she's extremely proud of the sacrifice and dedication of her fellow LAFD members. The two had feuded publicly over the response last month. Crowley blamed the mayor for budget cuts to the LAFD, saying that's why they were unable to contain the fires. It turns out the department's operating budget had technically grown in the past year. Meanwhile, Mayor Bass received a lot of flack during the tragedy because she wasn't even in LA when the fire started. She was overseas in Ghana for a work trip. Kristen Crowley was appointed in 2022 as the department's first female fire chief.
It's notable here that the mayor, who received a lot of grief for the fact that she was in Africa on a trip during the fires, is trying to point fingers at the LA fire chief. It was pretty public that there were these rare fire and wind warnings. That was well publicized, even though the mayor went on her trip. So a lot of people are saying, you're making Kristen Crowley the scapegoat here. And also the fact that Crowley, who it looked like a few weeks ago she was going to receive the axe. That's when she did all those media interviews, Jill, including with us at Mo News, that we posted on Instagram. And that sort of saved her job, at least for a few weeks. So the mayor did not like the fact that Crowley went out publicly and released all of the memos she had written to the mayor over the course of the past couple of years, demanding more budget for ensuring that she could better protect the city of LA. Now, interestingly here, there's an LA Times investigation that found that the LAFD could have ordered 1,000 firefighters to stay on duty when they realized that the winds were building to an alarming speed in those hours, in those days and hours leading up to the Palisades fire. But they opted out of the move. That would have doubled the force available to fight fires the morning it broke out in the Palisades back on January 7th. It also found that the department had more than 40 fire engines available that day, but only staffed 5 of them. Now, there's a lot of back and forth here. You have the union of the firefighters backing up Crowley. They say the mayor, again, is making her a scapegoat. Now, interestingly, Crowley has a number of allies on the city council, and she needs 2/3 of the city council to actually be reinstated, and she can appeal. And so we will watch for that. She has some support on the city council. So whether she will have an open fight here to get her job back is something we'll be watching.
From NBC News, an update on the Pope's medical condition. The Vatican reports that Pope Francis is still in critical condition, but was able to work from his hospital bed on Monday. He has been in the hospital for over a week and still has significant kidney and lung problems that are keeping him there. Although statement on Monday said he is showing slight improvement. We are told they are not changing the status of his condition from critical because his illness is complex and they want to be conservative with the prognosis.
So a good update, kind of, on Monday as things were really heading in a negative direction last week and during the weekend. You actually might have seen that New York Cardinal Timothy Dolan described the Pope as probably close to death over the weekend. Not sure if that was an assumption or things have changed over time, but he is suffering from a number of major issues, including at times they describe partial kidney failure. He was admitted to the hospital more than 10 days ago, diagnosed with double pneumonia. It's the longest hospital stay the Pope has ever had for lung issues, and he's missing part of a lung from a situation he had as a child. So particularly concerning there. The Pope's doctors are not putting out a prognosis like he's totally going to be back anytime soon. They say that's due to what they say is the complexity of the clinical picture, meaning they're not going to issue any predictions here. On Monday night, the Vatican summoned all the cardinals residing in Rome to St. Peter's Square to recite a rosary for the Pope. And so we'll continue to watch those developments.
From Politico, you may have heard rumors yesterday that the Philadelphia Eagles had refused a White House invitation to celebrate their Super Bowl victory. It turns out those were just rumors. The Eagles still may make the trip down to D.C. if they're even invited. An Eagles official tells the media site Outkick, quote, "We would be honored to visit the White House and we look forward to receiving the invitation." But that's the thing. The White House has yet to extend the invite. But getting back to the rumors that dominated social media, it started with a report in a newspaper called the U.S. Sun earlier this month, saying that the Eagles were refusing the invite because the owner doesn't agree with President Trump's policies.
We should note for the record, Jill, we have in this speed read and otherwise never used the U.S. Sun as a source, and it looks like for good reason.
Yeah, and over the weekend, the U.S. Sun report was sent around online. It was criticized by MAGA supporters on X. It was celebrated by the left. Podcaster and former Fox News personality Megyn Kelly joined the conversation. She reposted the report and said, quote, "Go F yourselves, Eagles," in all caps.
She did. She was taken by the report. Several hours later, she's like, oh, I see that there's been a correction issued. So this got a lot of people worked up. And so sometimes we will tell you stories here in Speed Read just to clarify things because they become big, rumors. People hear things, and then certain media personalities even get convinced by fake news that is out there. Now, altogether, this wasn't totally surprising. Why? Back in 2018, when the Eagles won their first Super Bowl, the Trump administration canceled the team's White House celebration. There were disagreements at the time, if you remember, over the national anthem and kneeling during the national anthem. So the fact that it didn't happen in 2018 led people to think that, this headline looks like it could totally be true this year. It looks again like that is not true. We're waiting on a White House invite, and the Eagles are eager to head to Washington.
From the Wall Street Journal, some good news for those of you looking to buy a home. The power could be back in your hands, at least according to one study. The average home is currently changing hands for 2% less than the listing price, according to the real estate brokerage Redfin. They're reporting that home buyers may have the most leverage over sellers in years. This after a decade of bidding wars and inflated prices. The change is due largely to more homes being on the market. New listings increased by almost 5% this January as compared to last. Demand is also decreasing because many buyers are deciding not to buy at the prices currently listed, which are well above levels a few years ago. Some of the most buyer-friendly markets are surprisingly in Florida, which has seen some of the steepest increases in home prices. And that's because those high prices encouraged more building. But a lot of people feel that they can't afford homes at the costs listed, so there's more inventory on the market. The median existing home price in the U.S. this January was about $397,000, up nearly 5% from a year ago. But at least there's some room to negotiate now, allegedly.
So running the numbers there on that median price home of about $400,000, that's about $8,000 off. If you're buying a house closer to $1 million, it's about $20,000 off. Jill, I know you're going through a home purchasing process right now. Does this ring true, at least where you're looking?
No, not at all, actually. It feels like it is still very much a seller's market. So I don't know if that's hit Long Island yet.
Yeah, the thing you always need to keep in mind when we tell you these trend stories is these are national averages, right? So they might be it's the case that it's true in the majority of areas, but certainly not in all areas. And so it looks like Florida is an example where this might be true. Jill, if you're ready to move the family down to... I mean, you were here for a few days over the weekend.
Well, I was actually chatting with a broker in Florida who works in the Boca Raton area. And she was saying that there are a lot more houses on the market and they're sitting for a lot longer. Mostly, she said, because they're priced really high. So I guess in that case, the article rings true that perhaps buyers are just saying enough. The prices are just simply out of control.
I'm not going to pay whatever you want anymore. And write you those love letters about how much I'm going to be obsessed with your house. Remember that was like a moment during COVID.
Yes, trying to like really tug at the heartstrings of the seller. And it's like, they really say that, everyone says they care who buys their house, but they just are going to go to the highest bidder. And finally, from NPR, singer Roberta Flack, who broke through as one of the most important and beloved singers of the 1970s with a sound that combined soul, jazz, rock, and pop, died Monday at the age of 88. She had been battling ALS. You might know her from some of her hits, The First Time I Ever Saw Your Face, and Killing Me Softly with his song. In the early 70s, she earned 8 Grammy nominations and 4 wins, and remains the only solo artist to win the Grammy for Record of the Year 2 years in a row.
Yeah, that feat was finally duplicated not by a solo artist, but by U2 back in the early 2000s. Back to Roberta Flack here. She was musically gifted from a very young age. She actually won a scholarship to Howard University at just 15 years old. And she was obsessed with classical music. She said that she would refer to Bach and Chopin as, quote, my guys. Her real ambition was to be a concert pianist. But she was told back then in the 1950s that this classical music world, it's mainly white. You shouldn't bother. Maybe go become a teacher of music. And so ultimately, upon graduating Howard, even though she was this Wunderkid when it came to music, she taught at schools and then she needed money. So she began performing at clubs and then eventually was discovered and then starts to put out albums and then has this string of hits in the early 70s, including Killing Me Softly. So a little background on this. And honestly, I didn't know much about this history, Jill, as I began digging yesterday. So the singer who wrote this, the writer/singer who wrote this, her name is Lori Lieberman. She had sent a demo of the song to a number of artists, including Helen Reddy at the time, a major pop star. But a couple of them were turned off by the song. Some of them didn't like the title, Killing Me Softly. Roberta Flack was on a flight. She heard it and was like, oh my God, I'm obsessed with this. She then goes to the Greek Theater in LA, performs it. She was opening for Marvin Gaye at the time. And who's in the audience but Quincy Jones? And he saw the audience erupted at the end. Roberta Flack performs this version of Killing Me Softly. Quincy Jones says, do not perform it again until you record it so you can own this song. So she then performs it. It becomes ubiquitous, becomes this huge hit in 1973, and effectively becomes her signature song for the rest of her life. Of course, some of us might discover it for the first time in the 90s with the Fugees and Lauryn Hill. They have a famous version that also went to #1 of Killing Me Softly, their remix. But certainly, I'm not sure there's many people in our audience today, Jill, who have not heard, if not Roberta's version of Killing Me Softly, Killing Me Softly.
What I appreciate about that song is that it doesn't sound like anything else.
Yeah.
It's such an original. And that's basically as far as my musical analysis goes. But that is what I think of. But I don't know. That's about as far as I can.
It's okay.
We
didn't assign you an essay, Jill.
You get one sentence. That's
you get it. You're like, I like the song. It's unique. We'll accept that answer, Jill. All right. That takes us to On This Day in History. As promised, we begin with an interesting piece of history. On this day in 1828, John Adams, well, they call him John Adams II, even though he's John Adams' grandson and John Quincy Adams' son. On this day in history in 1828, John Adams, the grandson of John Adams, married his cousin at the White House. His grandfather, John Adams, we should note, married his third cousin. Abigail was actually his grandfather's cousin. Intermarriage looks like it skipped a generation. John Quincy did not marry a relative, but then John Quincy's son, John Adams, naturally marries his first cousin on his mother's side at a private ceremony at the White House, I guess following in a family tradition of sorts. He did not follow in a different family tradition, being president. Of course, his grandfather, John Adams, was president. His father, John Quincy Adams, was president. Sadly, John Adams II, as they called him, would die of alcoholism in his early 30s. Intermarriage, by the way, continues into the White House in the 20th century with FDR. He actually, when Franklin Roosevelt marries Eleanor Roosevelt, her name is Eleanor Roosevelt. She was of the Long Island Roosevelts under the Teddy Roosevelt family, part of the Teddy Roosevelt family tree. FDR was from the upstate New York Roosevelts. So there you go, a bit of history of marrying cousins of the White House. I imagine you weren't expecting that on your Tuesday morning, Jill.
You know what? I've come to expect anything, Moshe, from On This Day in History. You never know what you're going to get.
All right, let's fast forward here to the 20th century. On this day in 1964, a 22-year-old boxer named Cassius Clay shocks the world, taking down Sonny Liston, at the time considered the biggest upset in the history of boxing. To celebrate his heavyweight title, 22-year-old Clay goes to a party in Miami that night, attended by his friend Malcolm X, the outspoken leader of the Nation of Islam. Later that year, Clay becomes enamored with Islam, with the Nation of Islam, and decides, as a descendant of a formerly enslaved person, to reject the name given to his family, Clay, Cassius Clay, and take on the new Muslim name, Muhammad Ali. And we end here with a bit of music history. On this day, 62 years ago, a 20-year-old singer out of New York named Barbra Streisand put out her debut album. She would go on to, have a pretty successful career there, Jill.
I think I've heard of her.
I think I've heard of her.
Although I shouldn't even joke, because yesterday I couldn't name anyone in the Jackson 5 except for Michael Jackson.
And you claim that Janet was in the Jackson 5, even though she was 2 years old at the time. Not my finest moment here on the podcast. It's okay, Jill. It wasn't 1980s or 1990s music, so we forgive you.
It wasn't that far before that, though.
No, it was about 10 years before. And Jill, we will end here with some 80s music. Tears for Fears released their second album, Songs from the Big Chair, 40 years ago today, February 25th, 1985, with one of my favorites, Everybody Wants to Rule the World, which works so well for like half the stories on this podcast. I'm sensing a theme. All right, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It helps us grow. Follow us, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store. Speaking of which, Jill, if some people recall the Dennis Miller Show, back to Everybody Wants to Rule the World, he used that song as his theme song for his talk show. I don't hate that idea. Like for our podcast of coming up with of taking a real song and using it. Well, it's either that or We Didn't Start the Fire are probably like our two more relevant, right, songs here. But if anybody has a contact for Tears for Fears, I imagine they might make a deal to license Everybody Wants to Rule the World to us. We'll check it out. Yes, if you tune in one day and it's not our usual hip-hoppy beat at the top or however you would describe it. Which, by the way, is from a free library. Yes, because that's how we roll. Because we didn't have any ads when we started this podcast. All right, everyone. Thank you.